roads you were told to go on forever, and how many times you must lie to keep it together. It goes on, it goes on, it goes on.
Leslie came into existence about 1840 when people started moving in here, mainly from the Appalachian Mountains, and came here due in large part to the Panic of 1837, as people tried to recover from economic depression. And once they came here, it was a hard scrabble life still yet, and it would remain so until the railroad came in 1903. And that's what brought industry and a remarkable amount of wealth into the town, although the boom would last less than 20 years. But Leslie was named after Sam Leslie. The Leslie family was a prominent family here, having arrived in 1838. And Sam Leslie was an officer in the Civil War, fought for the Confederacy, and afterward, the town was called Wallace Cove, and they renamed it in 1887 after Mr. Leslie, and so it's been known by that name ever since. Mr. Leslie was a storekeeper here in town. He evidently had some amount of wealth that he brought with him. His wife was a second cousin to Andrew Jackson, and so I don't know if they had any of the wealth or not, but they certainly had some type of means of sustaining themselves. He also grew crops here, and he would, as well, records indicate that he would be good for a loan for someone, or he would take in a destitute child, and things like that. The town center pretty much was north of Begley Creek. The original church, McGuire Chapel, probably the cemetery is probably about a quarter mile, maybe not quite that far past Begley Creek, and the church set there on the north side of the cemetery. And I don't know exactly where the stores were. Leslie's property was down here in the downtown district. His house was located there. As you come into Leslie, if you looked, pulled up to the highway where it curves around, if you looked to the right, you would see where his house sat there, what we call the old Legion Hut. That was where his house was. And he owned most of the property that currently makes up the downtown district of Leslie. He came here in 1838. He settled this area along with several other people. There were people who predated him here. But he built a store here, and by the time the railroad came in, there were 4 stores here, and so it was a town, though, that really didn't do very much. I don't know that it would have ever amounted to very much had the railroad not come through, but then the Federal Highway came through here, and in 1926, Leslie was attached to Highway 65, and that certainly has been a lifeline for the town as well. Well, the cooperage was Leslie's biggest industry. And so the cooperage, which of course is a barrel factory, came in here in 1906. Leslie, Searcy County were never known for their wealth, but one thing they were very wealthy in was natural resources. And one of those natural resources was timber. And so there was a lot of virgin timber here still at that time, and quite a bit of it was white oak. And so white oak was important in the whiskey barrel business. And at the time, H.D. Williams was set up in Poplar Bluff, Missouri, and he had run the course of the area there. He had depleted the timber, and he was looking for somewhere else to go. So the local newspapers here ran an advertisement talking about the natural resources that were available here, mentioning the mining going on north of the Buffalo River, as well as the what little agricultural land there was But it was the timber that caught Williams's eyes. He sent some men over to search it out, and so they came, surveyed this, and they bought some of the property on the spot. He was able to lease some of it, able to buy quite a bit more. In fact, he owned much of the Little Red River Valley going out west of here, and what he could not buy outright, most of it he was able to lease. That's where his timber came from. And so he came here, he put in a lot of money to build that plant, and it opened for production in 1906. And at the height, they were putting out 5,000 barrels a day. So that's a lot of timber coming in out of the woods and then all the way to a finished product. And the railroad was shipping that out, taking most of it east of the Mississippi River, where the whiskey industry, at least most of it, is located. And so when he came here, he also brought with him some experienced hands. He needed some people who already knew about the cooperage industry, and so the Hogg family came in with him. Hogg was a butcher here, but he, of course, had quite a bit to do in feeding the people there. But a lot of the hands who knew about the business were African American, and so Williams he came personally to Leslie, and he met with the city council, and the city council assured him that they would protect the African American population when they moved here. And then he built company housing, an area we call Dinktown, and so there he housed them and was able to provide housing for those who moved here and didn't have anywhere to live. Housing was in shortage at that time in Leslie. So once he built up his industry here, it kept growing. He was not the only one out there. There at the height, there were 5 plants that had something to do with timber, milling timber, but his was by far the largest one. And so Williams was the biggest employer here. At the height, there were over 1,000 people on the payroll. At any given time, there would be probably 700 to 800 people on the payroll there. So a huge industry here for a town like this. The population at the time, the official census gives it at 1898, but it's estimated that the population exceeded that somewhat. I don't really have a good estimate of what it would have been, but perhaps 2,000 to 3,000, maybe even a few more than that. The town really boomed after the mill came in until the mill burned in November of 1912, and it put several people out of work for a time until he could rebuild. And it was his insurance on the mill that saved the day, but he had to reorganize. He renamed the company Export Cooperage, and it was not as big an operation, but it still kept people employed. And at the height, there was about 700 on their payroll at the time. And so in 1924, Export Cooperage burned. And he was never able to recover from that. Small operation stayed here until 1927, and that's when they sold out. Actually, he had to declare bankruptcy, and they shipped everything to Russellville and then eventually to Memphis, where the cooperage industry continued. Well, at that time, most everything was shipped in barrels, and you would go to the store often and find things not set on a shelf like we find today, but instead sometimes it would just be there in the barrel. Crackers, for example, came in barrels. Clothing sometimes came in barrels. Lots of things in the hardware store, nails and things that would be hard to ship any other way, that'd be in barrels. And so there was a demand for that, but the overriding demand was the whiskey industry. And they needed wooden barrels because in order to ferment and become the product they wanted it to be, it had to be in a container that was able to expand. And wood allowed for that expansion, and thus the fermentation took place. And that went for most all different types of liquor or drinks, whatever you want to call it. And so therefore, it was very much in demand for that until about 1950, when the demand for barrels gave way to other things. But still yet, the liquor industry still uses barrels, wooden barrels, for a lot of their products, simply because of the expansion component there. Well, everyone in town, just about everybody, was in one way or another associated with a cooperage. And so the biggest employer by far, and it was basically the mainstay here. So whatever the cooperage wanted, they pretty well got. And from what I understand, Williams did not take advantage of that. Williams was largely responsible for bringing the public school here in the town. Of course, it was the progressive age at that time, but Marshall had just opened a school. We had an academy here, but Williams was demanding a public school for Leslie. And so he went before people, and he, in fact, put up, I think, the first $1,000 or so into an account, and wanted to raise funds to build a large school building. And so he wanted to hire a professional faculty. Those were two things that he was intent upon and that he was not willing to compromise on. So therefore, Leslie began to get behind him. And in 1909, the school district was formed and would remain here until 2007, when consolidation closed it. Another thing he's responsible for, would, in large part, would be the downtown district. The buildings along Oak Street probably went up before the cooperage did. Perhaps there might have been a building or two on Main Street that did, but most of those buildings were built during the era of the cooperage. And it was the cooperage that gave rise to the downtown district and made it possible, along with the railroad. But it was the railroad that was the lifeline of this town. Otherwise, we never would have had the means to ship all the product, and so it was what made the cooperage possible. The railroad moved out in 1946, and it was there were two competing lines, one here and the one on the White River. The one on the White River was under better management. In fact, it still operates today. This one had lots of trouble, a huge labor strike. The longest labor strike in history took place on this railroad line. And that was in large part the demise of the boom period in the town. So you might as well say that the Great Depression started in Leslie with that railroad strike, because we never fully recovered from it. But once they did get the railroad running again, they were able to move product out, but a lot of people moved away. You had people who had to close up business and were not willing to risk an investment of opening the business back up. You had a lot of people who, just gave up on the idea of, seeing this thing fully recover. So therefore, it was in large part the beginning of the economic decline of Leslie. The town really, as far as the city limits go, is not a whole lot bigger than what it would have been then. Main Street probably ran about the length that it does now. The town was gradually growing southeastward and northeastward. You have there's one block going northeastward along Oak and Walnut, You'd have three blocks going southward along Main, and it was a pretty steady progression there as far as the building of the town went. They have added sections to it, the Greenhaw edition, the Parks edition, the Bratton edition, I think it is, to expand to the outer limits of the city limits, but some of that land is no longer of invalid use right now. For example, a lot of the hillside is covered in timber again, yet it's still in the city limits. So the main street, of course, is called Main Street, and Oak would be the other main street. That's where the school was. The Baptist church set up on Oak Street. The Methodist church set up on Walnut Street, corner of Walnut and High. And those are the two main congregations going back to the beginning, at least of the incorporation of the town. The Methodist church goes all the way back to the 1840s. And even though the Leslies were Baptist in faith, they certainly supported the Methodist church and it growing up here, because they pretty well united around one church and one faith. And but then other churches have added. The Assembly of God here in town came in the 1930s, and a few other churches are in existence here. But those two are the mainstays, and then the Assembly has a decent crowd now as well. As the old saying goes, the hills have a way of calling you back, calling you home, and so lots of people stay here because this was their only home. I was one of those kids in school. I was never going to leave Leslie. I was going to stay around here, teach like one of my heroes right here, and I'm just going to be right here in Leslie. And what did I do? I haven't had an address in Leslie since 1990 when I started my education career. So I've always taught away from here. But nonetheless, people stay here because of family. That's the main reason they stay here. They also stay here because of factors. It's very pretty here. The scenery here is pretty, and we're beginning to capitalize on tourism now, but for a long time the town never really capitalized on that. But with 4 restaurants in town, a couple of art galleries, got a baking company here in town, several things like that certainly tend to draw more tourists in. Plus the proximity to the Mountain View and the Ozark State Folk Center, and then the Buffalo River, less than 20 miles north of here. And so Greer's Ferry Lake, about 35 miles southeast of here. So it's within easy reach as well of other destinations people might make. But it's beginning to make a little bit of a comeback as far as tourism goes. And it's hard to make a living around here. Most people who live in Leslie, if they don't work from home, they drive to Clinton or to Marshall, which not many of them drive to Marshall anymore. It's on dead center as well. Perhaps Mountain View. Several I knew growing up drove to Harrison or Conway as well.
The railroad was the first thing, as Anthony mentioned there, that really brought Leslie into existence. And the railroad followed the creek, because the creek doesn't climb hills and it doesn't go into valleys. Mm-hmm. And the railroad followed the creek in here. Well, that became the center of Leslie. And as it grew in proximity to the railroad. They didn't look at the compass. And so the streets now in Leslie don't run north and south and east and west. They are skewed to line up with the railway. So that was the beginning of where we are. And now when you drive up Oak or Elm Street, it appears you're going north, but yes, you're about 20 degrees off.
Exactly.
I'd like to add a little bit to the whiskey industry that he was talking about. The barrels, before they were sent to, well, no, probably not before they were sent, but the barrels before they were used for whiskey were charred inside. They burned the inside of that and formed charcoal. And then the barrel was filled with whiskey and put on a rack and dated. And the longer that they let it sit there, the better the quality of the whiskey. Now, when the whiskey first came out of the still, it's nothing but it's just alcohol. It's just that's it. And today, all of our ethanol is the same thing as what we call moonshine was here. It's just pure ethanol. And when you put it in the barrel, it begins to change, and it does become aged whiskey, and that gives a better quality to it. And the older they leave it in there, of course, the longer you got your money tied up too. But the older it gets, supposedly, the better it is. The only thing that I can remember the old folks talking about, he has already covered. But we did have the community there that was Dinktown, and it also was moved from Dinktown back over along where the rodeo arena is now, and that was also for the cooperage.
Okay.
Along that line, and how much of it was, I don't really know. But the cooperage built a huge pond for the water, and it was the only pond we ever had in this area that was concrete lined. And it was just a huge thing, and it became known as the mill pond. And when I was a kid, the mill pond was still there. And it had, of course, it was old and it hadn't been maintained, and it didn't hold water very well, but it was still there. And at that time when they built it, it was for water to run all the machinery, which was all steam operated. And they had to have the storage of the water or you couldn't have steam. But all of the mills were steam operated at that point. And other than that, all I know is when the mill went, Leslie almost went with it. At one time we had a population close to 5,000 people. And then, of course, the people, when I was a kid, the people were leaving here. That was back in the early 50s. They left here by the droves going to, and the word is California, not California.
Right.
Everyone was moving to California. And you could get a job in California. And I remember I had one uncle who chewed tobacco all the time. And he moved to California. And they put him on a dozer plowing the fields with that bulldozer. And at that time there was no air conditioning. And so he was chewing that tobacco, which during the day became laden with sand. And he wore his teeth off chewing that tobacco with the sand in there. But in 1950, he was able to buy a new car. And he bought a little 6-cylinder Studebaker.
My goodness.
And it was nice and pretty. And he drove that thing from California back here to visit and took everybody a ride. And that was Uncle Lloyd, and boy, that was a big thing. I thought, he was really doing well. He had a Studebaker. But most of our population left during those times. And a few of the people that left, my dad was a mail carrier, and he always had a job, so we didn't have to leave. But
So,
some of us just stayed here because we like it. I left when I was a young man and worked elsewhere. I was a meat cutter for Safeway in Little Rock for a while. And the Hogg family that you mentioned had taught me how to cut meat when I was a young man. And I went on to Little Rock and had no problem at all finding a job. Then when I decided to go back to college, I used that as my weekend and my summer vacations.
Right.
And I could always go down to Safeway and they'd let me work 2 weeks while this guy went on vacation. I'd change stores and do it again. But that meat cutting skill helped me while I was going to school for other things. And I still use that skill quite a bit. I like it.
tell me about you growing up around here.
Well, I guess it was sort of like everywhere else. We had odd things that we did. probably shouldn't tell you this, but I will. There was one day in the year, it was October 31, and October 31 allowed almost any kind of menace you wish to get out and get into, you could find it. We would go. And at that time, we had no sewer system. And the facility, I'll call it, always sat in the backyard, wasn't too well protected, and it became a project on Halloween night to sneak around and turn those outhouses over. And my goodness, that caused a big problem, for the next morning. But anyway, it happened there for a while till they finally got so rough on us we had to quit. And I remember one Halloween, the store where Eric now has his carnivores.
Yes.
Okay. One morning after, well, that would have been on the first of the new month there, everybody came to town and there was a wagon up on top of that store. And that wagon had been taken apart. Somebody who knew which was right and left and how they get them apart. And they had let ropes down from up on that store and put that wagon up on the store. So, we had a lot of fun at things like that. But you had to make your own fun. We did have a movie theater here in town. And at that time, it was very expensive to go. Now, I would mow yards and cut weeds and do whatever I had to for a little extra spending money, but when I had a quarter, I was in good shape. I would go to the movie. It cost 14 cents to get in. When you walked in the door, there was a little gum machine there to get your penny. Then you could get a Coke, an old bottle of Coke, and a sack of popcorn. And all of that was for the 25 cents. And you could go in and watch Roy Rogers and have a good time. I had a second occupation at that time. We had a good cow. And we got more milk than we could use. And so I would milk that cow, or Dad, when I would milk that cow early in the morning to take it in, and Mom always strained it through some kind of cloth that she had there. And then it went into glass quart bottles and had the little paper tub. And I had a carrier that I would put those in, and it would hold 8 quarts. And I had a milk route. And before school, all this would go on, and I had my 8 quarts. And each customer, I had to put it behind the screen to keep the dogs or whatever from getting it, But then when I came home from school that afternoon, I retraced my route and picked up my bottles, and they'd have them, most of them would be washed and cleaned. If not, of course, go home and we did it. But now that was a big deal for the whole family. We got a quart for that fresh milk, and that was a lot of money. And I think I'm remembering right, it was a quart. But anyway, that was part of our living money that we used. But we made it just fine. Now, we raised hogs, and we'd kill a couple of big hogs every fall, and had our milk. We kept chickens. We raised a big garden, and we ate good, and we're all happy.
Right.
And we played music for entertainment. We didn't have a TV. We did have an old radio, and had that aerial wire, as it was called, strung out into a tree. And that thing was battery powered, huge big battery. And in the wintertime, as the temperature dropped, the voltage in that battery would drop. And on Saturday night, you took that battery and put it over behind the stove on a chair and let that battery get good and warm, because it would work better. And then when the Grand Ole Opry came on, we'd hook that dude up, and we had the Grand Ole Opry on Saturday night. I don't ever remember recharging it. We just heat it up, and when it's gone, you had to get another battery. It was non-chargeable, but it would last a long time. Finally, we got a telephone. there was a telephone office here in town. One lady ran it. Her name was Nola.
Yes.
And she ran that for years and years and years. And when you called or used your phone, you turned a crank. There was a little generator, a magneto, and it would energize and buzz in her office, and she would plug you in. Well, she knew who you were, and she didn't say, "What's your number?" She would say, "Jim, what do you need?" And then I'd tell her who I wanted, and she would connect that, and that was our telephone service. And we had party lines at that time. And when one customer, and we'd have like a short and a long, or a long and a short and whatever. And but whoever all was on the party line, every one of them answered, and it was a gossip session. You know, and you didn't dare tell anything you didn't want told because you were just broadcasting with the telephone. But it was wonderful. And when I did work at the grocery store, and as soon as I was old enough, I started working at the grocery store every afternoon, and I would stock shelves and deliver groceries. And part of the time, I delivered those groceries on foot. You know, I would carry the groceries and go to wherever they went. And if I went in and they were working, I would put the milk in the refrigerator and all of that stuff, and knew everybody in town. Everybody knew me too. But anyway, I worked in that grocery store, and that helped me with my money during the older years there. And that's also where I learned to cut the meat, which ended up being very good for me.
Which store was that?
It was where Eric's got the store now. That was Boyd's Market at that time. And it was the old hog market, the original hog market too.
Right.
And then John Hogg, which was a member of the old Hogg family, the early ones, he taught me exactly how to cut the meat and make the sausage. And I'd go in every morning early and start cutting up that pork or beef or both, and I'd make 40 pounds of sausage and 40 pounds of hamburger.
My goodness.
And during the day, I'd sell that, and sometimes I would have to do it again. And of course, now we had steaks and roasts and all of that.
Sure.
Well, we have primarily restaurants. That's our big thing, our best businesses. The most profitable one probably in town is Wade's service station over there, sitting there on Highway 65, and it's hard, and he's got 10 pumps, which usually Leslie had one pump, but now he's got 10, and lots of times we have to wait to even get in there. It's constant 24 hours full. So that business is there, and we have a lot of cattle in this area. So a big part of our dollar bills comes in from the cattle that we raise. And we have good land, it grows good grass, and good grass grows good cattle. I was in that business for many, many years, and I now sold my cattle, but I keep me a couple of steers that I kill every year, and we have good fresh beef all year long. And at Christmas time, when all of my relatives come, they all leave with a big cooler of ground beef, and that's my present to them. So needless to say, I always have a pretty good crowd at Christmas.
Yes, sir.
But that's, I guess, dollar-wise, the beef industry is probably the best thing we have. We're still in the timber industry, too. Those trailer trucks are still coming in, and I've wondered all my life where they keep getting those trees.
Yes, me too.
But, of course, about every 20 years, it's a regrowth. So we're still in the timber industry, but probably the biggest thing is the beef industry. And a lot of the land that used to grow the trees has been cleared and now grows grass for the cows. And we had a couple of ice factories, I'll call it. We had one halfway between here and Marshall, which would be 4 miles from here, and then there was another one in Marshall. And every morning there would be a ton truck go up there and load up with ice, and here would come Barney Jennings, or one of those guys, and he went door to door for the people that wanted it, and he wore a leather covering over his back and had a big set of ice tongs, and he would reach out there and grab that 50-pound block of ice and bring in, and we didn't have an ice box. And we had no wooden box, but it really wasn't an ice box. And we couldn't have one every day. But every few days, Mom would get one for the weekend, and we could have iced tea. But we didn't have it through the week. We just had to make it without that.
Right.
Till we finally got a refrigerator. And the refrigerator that we got, we didn't call it a refrigerator. We had another name for it. And the name of it would indicate the company that made it. But Frigidaire made it. Well, Frigidaire became the name of all of them. And no matter who made it, we still called it the Frigidaire. And one old fellow, Lawrence Thurston's dad, one day said, "Jim, quit saying that." I said, "Why?" He said, "This is General Electric." He said, "The way you're talking about that, it's like saying my Chevrolet's a Ford." So he straightened me out that, no, it was not a Frigidaire. It was a refrigerator, and that was it.
He brought up Mr. Thurston there. Florian Thurston made fiddles out of timber here and sold them all over the world.
Maple.
Maple.
Maple timber.
Sure were.
Growing up in Leslie was a wonderful place to grow.
Absolutely.
There was zero crime. Never heard of anything. Well, sometimes you'd hear about it. Somebody had stealed a ham of meat from somebody or something. But the people were all, in my opinion, noble-minded people. We occasionally would have, somebody would get in a fight or something over that, but usually by the next morning they'd forgotten it. And some of the people who were our town drunks, which we had some, and they were looked down on by some, but when we had a death and you'd go to the cemetery, those guys that sometimes they looked down on would be the ones over there with that pick and shovel digging that grave. And I always admired them because they did their part.
Sure did.
There was a lot of technology that went into those old wagons that people didn't think about or understand. To begin with, the carriage part of it, and that's what they called it in those days, what carriage was what's going to hold the weight. And that axle that goes across generally was white oak timber. Well, it wasn't just a straight piece. That had to have a little bit of curve downward on each end. And then that allowed for when the load was placed on the wagon, and it would straighten out a little bit, and then the wheels would be sitting straight. But when you didn't have a load on them, they sat up and they were kinked in a little bit at the bottom.
Right.
But they were well built, and there were several companies. John Deere built wagons. There was one built, Studebaker built
Yes, they did.
wagons,
So they got in business.
and they were well built. But when one of those axles would break, you couldn't go to John Deere and get it. And then we had these guys, Jim Treat and some of those that would go to the woods and find the right kind of tree and cut it and work that axle out and put the right curve in it exactly, and then put it on. And back to what I was telling you about left and right. When this wagon was put together, each axle had on the end an iron spindle that was threaded on the end. And on the right side, looking at the wagon from the back to the front, on the right side, the threads that held the wheels on were, we would call them right-handed threads, but as the wheel would turn, if it bumped that big nut that held it on, it would tend to tighten it instead of loosen it. And so you didn't have to tighten it very tight. The wagon rolling down the road would tighten that up. Now on the left, we had to reverse that, because if you put the right-hand threads on the left side of the wagon, when it touched that, it would unthread itself and your wheel would fall off. So they threaded it backward, but they were nice, and they would put an R on that hubcap if it went on the right, and an L if it went on the left. so you had no problem with that. But that wagon was pretty high tech, and the front end of that wagon was built with caster and camber, like lining up the wheels on a car.
Mm-hmm.
And the front end, the wheels turned in a little bit. They didn't roll straight. They had a little bit of inward turn to them, so that as the wagon rolled along, the right side tried to go to the left, and the one on the left tried to go to the right, and that kept it straight going down the road. So it wasn't wandering back and forth. And all that had to be planned in there
Mm-hmm.
and put in there to keep the wagon going. So the wheels were turned in at the bottom, and they were also from left to right in. So you could turn that wagon loose and let it go down the road and just travel straight.
There was also a wagon right here in Leslie. William Daniel was the wagon right, and his family still lives around here. And most of them are doctors. Most of them live in Marshall now. But he lived out west of here, about a mile on what we call Nubbin Hill. I grew up on the place where he had his wagon making, I guess, his wagon shed. But that had long since ceased by the time I came along. I mean, there wasn't even any relic of it there at that time. But he also kept horses, and at the time there was a stagecoach that came up from Plummerville, and every day mail service came from Plummerville to Marshall and back. And so it would be about 100-mile round trip going back and forth. And his place was a stop on that stage, and they would change horses there. 9 miles into Marshall, but every 20 miles you have to have a stop and to change the horses to keep them fresh. So it was 9 miles to Marshall, 9 miles back, 18 miles. And so he kept horses for the stagecoach line that came through and delivered the mail. Also carried passengers and freight. But nonetheless, the railroad supplanted that.
Also, this is not probably exactly the right kind of story that you like, but I'm thinking wagon. When I was a kid, and this had been going on for many, many years, and I might preface this by saying we had no sewer system. But there has to be some way to take care of the bodily needs. And so every house had we'll call it an outhouse, and it was always placed next to an alleyway where that wagon could come and go down beside all those outhouses. And there was an old man, I won't give his whole name, but we'll call him Charlie, that when I was a kid had a mule and a wagon. And there would be a lantern hanging on that wagon. And after dark, never came in daylight, after dark you would hear that old wagon coming. And we had no street lights. The only light you saw was that lantern. Mm-hmm. And he would pull up beside, he didn't have to get off and tell those mules. He'd say, whoop, that mule would stop right where he should. And he would manually shovel and clean out the material that needed to be moved and put it on that wagon. He then moved up to the next one and did the same thing again. Now, he had a place not far up here on Old 66 where he'd back that wagon in. And I don't remember what their water source was, but anyway, he'd unload it and wash his wagon. And sometime the next few days after that, he would come and knock on the door, and Mom would give him his 50 cents or whatever it was. And that was how he made his living. But it had to be done. And he did it. It was a very, very useful service. But, you know, people now can't even imagine a thing like that. Mm-hmm. But that's exactly the way Leslie was. These didn't have a hole.
Yeah.
There was no hole. It was just flat ground. Yeah. And in all those outhouses, there would be a barrel, mm-hmm. or a sack, and when it was used, you put lime. And that lime, of course, would degenerate everything. And it was, well, I'm not sure it was completely deodorized, but the lime that they put on there would completely decompose the material. And, you know, that's the way you did it in those days. And then times have changed.
Now, as far as shoveling goes, the back of the outhouse, most of them, there would be an opening about, what, 2 feet up?
Yeah, and then a flap that raised
right.
up.
And then he would be able to shovel the material out from the outhouse that way. Some of them did have a flap on it, some of them just sat there open.
Generally, they'd have a flap.
Yes, sir, they did. That most of the time they did.
But that was our complete sewer system. And it was economically feasible. It didn't cost a whole lot to run the sewer system.
Right.
We've changed our water system several times down through the years. Originally, we had a well. And, well, you probably won't even believe this, but I'm going to tell you. We had a well, and the well went dry. Now, over in the cooperage area, there was a well over there. It was known as the sulfur pump. And the water that comes out of there is sulfur. The old pump is still there, and it has been there since probably 1935 or 6. And the pump still works.
My goodness.
And during the drought that we had in the early 50s, most people's wells went dry, but you could still go over to the sulfur pump and take your barrel and get water. Even though it smelled and all that, you could still wash dishes in it, and we'd drink it because that's all we had. But back to where I started this. Our city well went dry. And there was that pump over there, the old sulfur pump. And one of the city council persons believed in water witching. And my grandfather was the water witch for the town. And when they were going to drill a well, they'd all go get Uncle Johnny Massey. And Uncle Johnny Massey would bring a peach tree limb, and he would walk around. And when he came to a stream, it would bend over, and then he would back up and count his steps. And it was so many feet per step till it quit pulling, and he'd tell them about how deep it was going to be. Now, this city councilman, his name was Lorne Lack. And Lord Lack stopped me one day, and he said, "Jim, did your grandfather teach you how to do that?" And I said, "Yes, he did." He said, "Do you think it works?" I said, "No, sir, there's no scientific reason for it whatsoever." I said, "The stick will move, but I can't tell you why." And he said, "I'd like to see that done." And I said, "Have you a peach tree?" He said, "Yes." I said, "Well, let's do it." So I looked his tree over, and I picked what I wanted. And I walked down through his yard. I said, "You just walk along, and if you come over water, it's going to pull down." And it did. Believe it or not, it did. And I backed up, and he said, wait a minute. He started yelling at his wife. Her name was Lorna, and his was Lorne. Lorna. He said, "Lorna, get out here." And she came out. He said, "Jim, do that again." Well, I walked down through there. There it went. And she and he were both just laughing. And I said, "What's going on?" He said, "That's our water line coming in." I didn't know where his water line was. He said, "Jim, got a job for you." I said, "Oh, me, what are we going to go in?" He said, "Now, you're saying you don't believe that'll work." I said, "I'm telling you the stick will move, but no, I don't believe it because there's no scientific data for it whatsoever. That's not going to work." He said, "Can you go over to that sulfur pump and go around that thing and find where that stream, if it is a stream, is going there?" I said, "I don't know, Lord. I'll go over there and walk around it." He said, "Well, I'd like for you to do that." So we went over to sulfur pump, and I backed off a few hundred feet, and just across the bridge over there in the edge of that field, I said, "I feel a pull here, Lord." Well, he marked it, and they drilled, And he said, how deep is that? I said, best I can tell from what Grandpa would have said, about 60 feet. They brought a well drill and went over there where he had marked that, and they drilled that well. And when they got down in the 60s, they quit. And they had sulfur water, boo-coos of it, and they hooked into that, and that became our water supply for a while, until the drought was over and we could get off of it. The old well is still there. It's just across the creek.
My goodness.
Now, that story is unbelievable. I know that. But that's the way it went. And the well is still there that they drew.
Did it have to be a forked stick or just a...
Yes, it had to be a forked stick
Okay.
for the way Johnny did it.
Yes.
Yes. And he didn't hold it like that. He held it up here.
Yes.
And it would bend over.
Right.
But anyway, we found the water, and Leslie had water. Now then, I'll go further than that. We now have water that comes all the way from up in Missouri in the, what's the name of that lake up there?
Table Rock?
No,
Taneycomo?
no, it's the big one.
Lake of the Ozarks? Bull Shoals?
Bull Shoals.
Okay.
And now we pump water all the way from Bull Shoals, and most of it is gravity flow. A few hills they had to pump it over, but most of it's gravity flow. And yes, our water comes from Bull Shoals.
Now, I can tell you this, in the summer of 1980, it did not rain here. It rained one day between, I think it's the 19th day of May and sometime in September.
Finally.
Yes, sir. It was almost 100 days. Not quite, but...
And a bunch of those days, the temperature was over 100.
Yes, sir.
The summer of 1980 was absolutely horrible here.
47 days, I think it was over 100 degrees. You know, not every day consistently, but there were many days, like for maybe a week or two, it might be over 100. But that summer, lots and lots of wells went dry, and the National Guard brought a pump truck up and went up to the Little Red River and filled the pump truck up and parked it over here in town.
Right.
And made it available to citizens, you know, who needed water. And it wasn't the cleanest water out there by any means, but it was water. And so, and that was the summer of 1980. I remember that very well.
I played a bad trick on a fellow one time who was making fun of the witching process and all that, and he wasn't science-minded at all. But anyway, he said, I'd like for somebody, and he used some foul language in there, I wish somebody would come up and show me something about that. I said, okay. He had long hair, and he kept it well combed. And I said, come in here a minute, Lance. He did, and I turned on the water in the sink, and just a small little stream, and I said, comb your hair. He combed his hair, and I said, don't touch that comb to that water, but hold it over there close to it. He held that comb over, and that water just turned and came his way. I said, now, Freeman, if you were outside, and there's water down there running, and you go out there, that water can't come up to you, so it's going to pull that down to it, isn't it? Mm-hmm. He looked at me. He said, I'll be. And I never told him any different. When he died, I thought about it. Yeah, I pulled one on you. But I didn't tell him, you know, this is just going to be static electricity. Yes, yeah. But I let him think that if the water was in the ground, it couldn't come up, but it'd pull down on whatever it was. He was happy with it, and he decided that'll work.
Right. My grandma could witch for water, but I sure never got that gift. So.
I have a degree in physics and one in chemistry. I had a double major, and I have fought through those and looked and looked and looked, you know, trying to come up with some kind of possibility of that working, and I can't find one. But yeah, like I told Lauren, nope, I don't believe it. Mm-hmm. Lauren was convinced. Mm-hmm. And anyway, they used that. It'd be hard to tell somebody that the city drilled a well spent all that money because of somebody witching the well.
Well, they had a huge water leak there at Russellville one time, and they kept trying to find, there's an old line, you know, long since dead, and they didn't even know there was any water in it, and they couldn't find it. And finally brought this man out to Witch for water and found it first try.
In those days, of course, the mill could save money if most of the wood or most of the work took place out in the woods. And so when they cut off one of those 40-inch blocks, stave bolt, they always split them, and then they'd quarter them. And you had to carry those for a ways, and you learned, you'd lean over and stand that thing on its end, and you'd lean over, but you put the flat side to your head and the sharp side on your shoulder. And you go to the wagon or your truck and just tilt that off. But in the early days, they didn't do that. They didn't quarter it up. They started off and they used those wedges and they took all of the sapwood off, because that you don't use in the barrel. Now the mill will cut them off now. And we get all those cut offs, you know, that I still burn it in my furnace. Sapwood, the white on the outside, if we wanted to use scientific terminology, we'd have that with cambium, but the old timers here would call it sapwood. And they had to take that off and leave the well, it's xylem actually, which is the hard center, and that's what they wanted in those barrels for high quality. So it took a lot of work to make a load, but they paid you good for it. Now the guy who built the cooperage also built a house here in town. And the house is the second house from here going north. When you walk out of here, and it's now neat and nice. It's a 2-story house, and it's green. When you leave here, if you go 2 houses up, it'll be on the right. It's now a B&B, but that was built by H.D. Williams.
Yes, sir.